Welcome to A Court of Transformation and Awakening. I'm Lorrie Gray.
And I'm Amanda Grace Harrison.
And in this episode, we are discussing chapters 40 and 41 of A Court of Thorns and Roses. Okay, we're still under the mountain.
Still under the mountain, damn it.
We're still under the mountain. We are not... I feel like, honestly, okay, looking at all of book one, it's a lot of rough. There was just like that little, like the whole first part was rough. And then we had like a handful of chapters where they're falling in love, that we had some sweet stuff. And now we got like all this under the mountain stuff. It's not really...
Yeah. So this is why book one is most people's least favorite book in the series.
It is.
But not everybody. I was just watching somebody yesterday who was like, "Look, not a popular opinion, but my favorite is book one, and my second favorite is book 5. And I was like, okay, so some people love this book.
They do. They do. I mean, I do feel like those were like, it's like, let's pull out themes. Most of them are a little bit dark right now. But, you know, almost anyone... You know, it's like, I do think if you don't, well, here's a question. So if you like don't like book one at all, now some people have said like, hey, it's not the best, like it really is the setup to book 2. You have to have book 1 to get to book 2. But then also if people don't enjoy book 1 at all, I'm like, I don't know if they will, because I mean, I liked book 1. I didn't love book 1. I wasn't like, oh my gosh, my life is radically changed and all other books are... well, now forever compared to book 2. It wasn't like one of those kinds of moments, but I enjoyed it while I was reading it. I don't know. So I'm like, if somebody isn't enjoying book 1 at all, I don't know. I'm curious if there's anybody who's like, I hated book 1 and still enjoyed book 2. I don't know. Yeah. But all that to say, these episodes, these chapters, they're a little heavy.
They're hard.
Because we're still under the mountain. Okay. But so here we are in second of 3 tasks. All right, so we are here, and this task is just awful.
Especially if you're illiterate.
If you're illiterate.
You have to solve a riddle that you have to read, and she can't read.
And she can't read. Now, we never learn whether or not this was just bad luck, right?
Yeah, and that's why she says fate, because she doesn't believe in fate.
Yeah.
But then she's like, she hadn't mentioned reading as an issue. She would have mocked me more if she'd known about my illiteracy. So she knows that Amarantha doesn't know. It was just fate, a cruel, vicious twist of fate.
Right, because she's more like, this is more like, you're stupid, so here's a riddle, because like you can't figure out my other one, so let's do this one. Not realizing how truly...
Not realizing she can't even read the riddle, so... It's definitely not going to be able to solve it.
Okay, so we have this whole chunk here where she's like, okay, there's 3 choices here that, you know, these are my lifeline. 2 choices would do me. 1 choice would open the gate. And her trying to figure this out. She started by trying to sound it out, the words, never going to get there. And even if she could, she knows she's not good at riddles. Lucian's freaking out. Just pick one.
And she's just going, I should say my goodbyes to Tamlin right now. This is what my life amounted to. These are my last moments. This was it. The final breaths of my body. The last beatings of my heart. And meanwhile, Lucian's like, just pick. Because you have a chance of getting it right. Like if you just let us die without pulling any of the levers. Yeah. Come on, just pick one.
Okay, so then this next little section, I feel like there were a couple like metaphorical things for me in here. Like one... her reasoning here.
I love her reasoning. I have all my orange flags over something is funny, and I have a lot of orange flags over. She's like, it must be 2. 2's a lucky number because it was like Tamlin and me, just 2 people. 1 had to be bad because 1 was like Amarantha or the Adder, the solitary beings. 1 was a nasty number. And 3 was too much. It was 3 sisters crammed into a tiny cottage, hating each other until they choked on it. Until it poisoned them. 2. It was 2. I could gladly, willingly, fanatically believe in a cauldron and fate if they would take care of me. I believed in 2. 2.
Right.
And then she goes to pull the second lever, and no, it's
pain. But this...
it's not 2.
But this, like, the way that she convinces herself of this, I'm like... I hate to... Again, this is one of those moments where I'm like, I don't want to necessarily want to be able to... relate to Feyre here, but I'm like, not these exact words ever, but I just relate to that, again, illogical logic that doesn't make sense, but also this like, it really fanatical, just kind of based on nothing reasoning.
Based on nothing now, but I believe in 2.
Right.
So believe in it. It's gotta be it.
Oh my gosh. I can't remember what the exact thing was, but my coach sent something out at one point recently. She's like, kind of like, if you're if your reason because if the reason that you think you're really going to succeed this time is because you believe it really hard, it's like, no, this time it's going to work because I just believe it. I just feel it. She's like, yeah, that's probably not going to work. And let's talk about why. Like, massive belief is important, but it's got to be based on more than that. But here's what I really felt for in this was she's trying to make a life-altering decision, and she doesn't have all the information.
She has almost none.
Almost none. And so right now, like, our family's in a season of making some really big choices about like where we're going to live and where we're going to move to. And it's the same thing. Like, I feel like we're trying to pick a lever without having the information.
I feel that.
Right? It hurts. And I don't like it. Which I heard somebody one time say, like, their definition for anxiety was sort of giving ourselves a job that we're not qualified for. Gosh, I'm totally going to botch this. Somebody's going to know exactly what I'm talking about and be like, good Lord, woman. But some version of like, the anxiety comes whenever we decide it's our job to be able to know the future and we're not actually able to do that. And so we're trying to push ourselves to know an outcome that's by nature unknowable. And when we give ourselves that task, like, of course it's going to create anxiety because we can't ever know the future. Like, it is by nature unknowable. And most of us are always being called to make a decision without all the information. Like, we don't get a crystal ball. We don't get to see exactly how it plays out. And yet we still have to make a decision. We still have to make a call. We still have to pick a lever. We still have to move forward or forever be just stuck and paralyzed. And so as a person whose biggest fear is screwing up, doing something wrong, getting in trouble.
That's your biggest fear?
Yes. Yes. Not in my head, in my nervous system.
Oh, okay.
That's what my nervous system panics about.
I literally panic about great white sharks and orcas more than I panic about that stuff, even though I don't even swim in the ocean.
No, okay, this is how bad it is. I cannot believe I'm going to share this on a podcast. I'm going to share this on a podcast, and then you have to remind me how to get back to whatever it was that we were talking about. Oh, I'm writing it down so I don't forget. We're talking about making choices with limited information and how we do that. But I saw a post the other day. So it's somebody that I follow, and she kind of made a "you're in trouble" post, and what it said was, I can't believe I'm having to say this, but I do. You are not allowed to copy my content and repost it like it's your own. That counts for screenshots of things that I've made. That counts for what I write in it. That counts for my emails. You may not copy whole paragraphs or whole emails and send that to other people like it was yours. Very valid.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to clarify that I have never, ever done that.
Yeah.
Ever. And whenever I'm thinking about it right now, I feel like I'm going to throw up because I was reading it, because the way I read it, just because it's like you, she was saying like you.
But it was a public post to everybody, right?
To everybody.
But when I read it, you had done it.
And my brain literally went to, I had a moment, I panicked for multiple minutes of like, she is talking to me and I must have done this without knowing this. And now I'm in trouble, and this is 1,000% written just to me.
Just to you.
And I almost threw up.
Oh my gosh. For a second, I was like, oh wait, I thought this was a public post. She sent this to you, so you must have. But this is a public post.
It was an Instagram post to her, however many, 10, 20, 100, I don't even know.
This was a very favorite moment for you.
But that's the thing, like getting something wrong and getting in trouble is the thing that makes my nervous system panic the most. It's completely irrational. It's not a thought process. It is. It's a distinction between, it's like nervous system based, because I know logically I've never done that.
Right.
Now, has there ever been a time whenever I've heard something from somebody and probably shared something that was inspired by that? Yeah. And usually I give credit and I'm like, it's possible, because my brain often remembers things so literally. I do have like a fear. I'm like, there are probably times, remember, I have read an email from somebody and then 3 months later said something and probably said a sentence that's almost word for word a sentence that was impactful from somebody else's thing. That has probably happened. unintentionally because
And that's not what she's saying.
That's not what
saying
she's saying,
this,
though.
just
She's
copy and
saying
paste the
she's
whole
saying
freaking thing.
yeah, she's saying like you took an entire email of mine and then tried to pretend like it was yours and passed it off.
Which I have to say, I have wanted to do that so many times. When I read really good copy, I'm like, oh, what if I just change like 3 words? No one will ever know.
Oh my gosh.
Never have done it, but I can definitely see
Because my
the
biggest
temptation.
fear is being in trouble, like I would never even be tempted. Like I would keep myself up at night, like wondering if somehow, I'm like, did I unintentionally plagiarize anything in the last week where somebody might find out and I might get in trouble? These things keep me up at night. So just reading this post, that it was like somebody did something wrong, but because it was like you, and so my brain read it, I almost threw up.
Wow.
So, okay, where does this come from? Best guess based on work with like neurofeedback specialist is probably just a situation that happened whenever I was pre-verbal, with doing something and getting in trouble and it just happening at the right developmental time that my nervous system believed that this was the most scary, dangerous thing ever.
Yeah. Because never even in school, like you never got in trouble for plagiarism or anything in school. You just wouldn't have done that. Yeah.
No, and it's not plagiarism. It's getting in trouble of any kind.
Oh, yeah.
Anything, like the fear of getting in trouble. And I have memories from childhood where I got in trouble and it was, and the punishment did not match the crime. And like I have memories of the punishments being severe and inappropriate and things like that.
Yeah.
But my fear of it came before that. I think it's pre-memory, pre-verbal type of stuff that happened. And like based on what triggers me now, I'm able to get a picture of what kind of a loose enough idea of probably what happened to trigger that. And it's just one of those things where like my nervous system still just believes that's the scariest thing ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some vulnerability. And that's the thing. And I've explaining this to people, a lot of people who don't understand like the nervous system or trauma, they don't get it. Because they're like, they try to give me like a logical thought. I'm like, no. Like, guys,
not logic.
My logical brain is totally fine. 1,000% I understand it. Like, and I can even talk you through it. Like, my mindset's fine. My thoughts are grounded. I'm a very logical person. I'm an overly logical person, if anything. And yet, when certain things happen, I immediately have a completely, like my nervous system ramps up because we might need to run away because we might need to be unsafe. It's not even, I'm like, there isn't even a thought. It's a neuroception. It's subconscious. It's instantaneous. There's not a thought to correct because it's not a thought issue. That's been interesting to try to explain to people, but it's not mindset. But yes, so that tying back to this, making choices when you don't have all the information is it's something that's hard for most people, but I do feel like it's a little extra hard for me because of what my brain's going to do with that.
Yeah.
But having to recognize for myself and for everybody, we never really have all the information because we can never predict the future. Like we just can't. But one of the things that I heard a while back that's been really helpful for me was to stop trying to put choices into categories of right or wrong. But that's what most of us do. Like, what's the right choice and what's the wrong choice? That there is a right choice and there is a wrong choice. And basically that's just like paralyzing language. Because if the only way to know the right or the wrong choice is to be able to predict a future that is by nature unpredictable, then we're just going to spiral in either anxiety or paralysis because we don't have enough information to make that choice.
Yeah.
And so what was presented, again, by one of my coaches, I think pretty sure this was Brooke Castillo, was she's like, no, there aren't right choices and wrong choices. There are 2 categories, but there are choices that you second guess, and there are choices that you have your own back for. And that's the category. She's like, the truth is like every choice is always made in a moment. And she didn't list this other thing, but like my other understanding of like, right, we're always making choices with not all the information. We're always making choices in the midst of an unknown future. We're always making choices and we're bringing into it our limiting beliefs, our lenses, our current level of self-awareness. Like we're always limited on both ends, how well we know ourselves and our lack of knowing the future. There's no way that it's going to be perfect. So we're always just having to make a choice. But yeah, but it's like, once you've made it, then what? And the understanding that no matter what happens after I make a choice, that I can always choose to have my own back, be my own soft place to land, support myself, not by saying it was a right or wrong choice, but understanding that typically when we make a choice, it was it was the best one we could make based on the information we had at the moment. Like we can't get more information in the future and then judge ourselves for not having that information in the past when we didn't have it. Oh my gosh, this was our truck story. Did I tell you about our truck?
I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
I don't think so.
We got to practice this so much. So when we started our Airstream travels, we had a smaller Airstream. It was like 22 foot. And we pulled it with a 16 passenger van, which was cool because we took out the middle seats and it kind of became a second little living area. And that worked great. And then both kids went through growth spurts and we didn't fit. So it was either we have to stop our travels or we have to upgrade. So we decided to switch to a 30-foot Airstream that had bunks. But so then we needed to get a bigger truck. We needed like a 3/4 ton truck to pull this thing because it was so heavy. So we sold the van and we actually had a truck picked out, but like it kept getting delayed for something. And then the guy ended up, even though we had put like a hold it for us thing, like the guy sold it. And basically there were a couple of options. And, you know, my husband was sort of having a moment of so much anxiety over buying it because, right, he's like, okay, well, this one's got these pros and cons and this one's got these pros and cons and like what's the right choice? And we didn't need one forever. We knew we weren't going to travel forever. I'm like, I don't want to buy a brand new $80,000 truck. We need a truck that's going to last a year. So we found one that was like a decent price and it was a little bit older. It's like, okay, we just need this thing to last a year. It's fine. And so we bought it and like he had these fears. And I'm like, okay, so the truth is we don't know. Either it's going to be a great truck or it's going to be a lemon or it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And we just have to make a choice and then deal with the consequences when they come. And gosh, did we get to practice that because the first, I think 10 times we drove it, it broke down.
Oh my gosh.
We drove it and something broke and we had to take it to the shop. And then we drove it again and something broke and we had to take it to the shop. And then we drove it again and something broke and we had to get towed off the highway. Took it to a shop. They like gouged us on the price. And at this point we were trying to book it to get to some place when we need to on time.
Oh, no.
And then the very next day we drove it, broke down again and had to be towed like off the highway. And at the end of a handful of weeks, we had put more money into it than what we'd paid for it initially. And one of them was like, what was it? Like a head gasket thing or something where they had to take the entire engine out. It's like a $5,000 or $7,000. It was like a ridiculously busy repair. And
this hurts.
It did hurt. Oh my gosh. Friend.
This hurts. Listening, I cannot imagine what it was like going through that. And your nervous system.
And the interesting thing is like I was chill because I had like pre-decided before any of that. Now again, in the moments like breaking down in 107-degree heat in the middle of the desert where there's no rest stops around, like that was a little stressful. Keeping everybody cool and making sure everything's fine. We had some stressful moments, but because I had pre-decided that this was a possibility and that if it happened, there was nothing we could do, I was like pretty chill.
Yeah.
But Chris was not. He just felt so guilty. Like I bought a bad truck. I bought like a thing. But again, it was that space of obviously we didn't know it was going to have that beforehand. If we had, we wouldn't have bought it. But then watching him like feeling so guilty and so bad, like he did something wrong. And like we could not have known this. If we'd known this, obviously we wouldn't have bought it. And at the end of the day, we did so many repairs that we basically had a new truck. And then it was great because everything that could possibly have been broken, like we basically replaced the whole engine. And it worked out fine because then we were able to sell it when we did sell it. Like, we basically got all of our money back. It was fine because we fixed the engine so well. But it was interesting watching this happen in that moment. And I was just thinking about all of this, of having to just make a call.
Yeah.
Like in the decision, it's like, and that one thing, we couldn't wait forever. Like we had a time frame, like we needed the truck by a certain day. And so we just had to be like, these are the options that are within driving distance. We don't know which one is best. Kind of flip a coin, pick one, and deal with the consequences. Like, because there really isn't much else you can do. I mean, you can do the work to examine the evidence that you know and think through it. But then at the end of the day, like, we just had to keep facing this choice of like, are we going to then use this as a reason to feel guilt and like beat ourselves up and have all of these things? Are we going to keep going back to, we had to make a call with limited information, we couldn't have known this, and this was the decision that we made, and it is what it is. Like, you cannot undo it once it's done. But I wish I'd kept track how many coaching sessions I've done in the time I've been a coach that were about, I have two choices in front of me and which one should I pick? It's one of those things that I've coached on so many times. People come into sessions like, I have to pick between these two things. And to watch all of the ways that our brain do this. But the biggest thing most people are afraid of is like, but what if I make a call and it's the wrong call? But what they're really most afraid of isn't the actual, when I play out, like, what are the consequences? Like, what actually happens if this is the wrong call? I mean, it costs some money or there's some things they have to sort out, but like, the fear isn't the practical stuff. The fear is what they're going to feel emotionally because of the way they're going to treat themselves when it doesn't work out. And it's very fun to really point out to people, I'm like, the thing that you're most afraid of is a thing that you can control and choose not to do.
Interesting.
It makes decision making easier whenever I'm like, okay, I just understand how it is. I'm not going to have all the information. I'm going to have to make a call. But on the other side of that, no matter what happens, I can decide that I will always have my own back, that I won't abandon myself, that I won't verbally abuse myself no matter what happens. And I think that's one of those places when we draw that line with ourselves, it honestly simplifies the decision-making process.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
It is. It's a good theory. Sorry, if you guys haven't noticed, I love understanding what's possible. I also am very committed to being very human about the truth of these things, because there's a difference between like, I get it and like, can I actually walk it out?
Yeah.
Sometimes, yes.
It's exciting to think that there's a possibility that I could just have my own back on things, that I don't have to second guess everything.
Yeah.
Even if I consistently make horrible decisions, I could choose to have my own back on those because they were my best guess at which one would be right at the time.
At the time. Yeah. And what else can we do?
Yeah.
What else can we do? But I think that the way that we treat ourselves afterwards is actually the best indication of what's going to happen with our next choice. Because if we're so busy like beating ourselves up and feeling terrible about ourselves and making it mean something awful about ourselves, we actually aren't going to be open enough to understanding the things we need to understand to learn to not make a similar mistake in the future. When it's like, oh my gosh, like, what do you call them? Scarlett O'Hara moments where it's like, I just can't.
I'm not gonna think about that.
That just really hurt and it's embarrassing, and let's just like pretend like it didn't happen and just move on. It's like, there's not enough space to actually learn. It's like, okay, what was going on there? What happened there? Because the shame causes us to hide, and then we aren't capable of doing the deep learning that we need to, if there's even such a thing. But yeah, so all that to say, for most things, if I get it right, quote unquote right, I don't like that word, but like, if I'm able to have my own back like half the time, I still consider that a win.
Yeah.
I don't deal in 100% for anything. But I'm like, did I have my back 10% more this time than last time?
There you go.
That's a win. Because it's never, I mean, we got 60,000 thoughts a day. Like, the chances of like managing all of those and not having a single one that was a little bit self-shaming. No, but I'm like, we're 10% more of them supportive. We're 10% more of them more grounded. We're 10% more of them we're more based in reality of what happened, as opposed to all or nothing thinking. That's a win.
It's a win.
It's a win. By the way, we do that a lot. I don't know if you guys can see it, but this was a thing that I learned from Amanda with like laughter yoga stuff. So taking that deep breath and the exhale, but especially if you make the sound with it, like the way that it resets the nervous system, like you can really feel it. Okay, so we'll practice. So we breathe in, and then when you let it out, you do like a, ah. Let's all do it together. gosh, and you just feel it immediately. Yes. It's so good.
So good.
Oh, it's so good for intense conversation. Okay, so speaking of intensity,
All right.
back in her chapter,
We are back
she's in this moment and she's got to just make a call without all the information and she's panicking. Okay, so then we have this interesting thing happens. So she's decided, based on her really highly logical, really grounded reasoning, that we will go down, we will, number 2 is the thing, and she grabs it and it hurts. Okay, so then she reaches for the first lever, also pain, reaches for the third lever, no pain.
And her fingers meet with stone, and she looks up through the grate, not 4 feet from her head, and finds through it a star-flecked violet gaze, which lets us know where the pain is coming from.
And because she's reaching with the hand that has the tattoo on it. Yeah, it's her right hand.
And I love that his face remains a mask of boredom. It's not in any way letting anyone else know that he's the one feeding her these clues.
Yeah. Which he's good at, but she's been very perceptive, and it seems like he's fooled, or like whatever's going on. Like, I don't know how many other people are picking up on the fact that there is more to this character, but she's already kind of aware there's more to him. But I love this, like, where I could only trust him. I could only give myself up, again, forced to concede by my helplessness.
Helplessness. Oh, I hate helplessness.
And so we've got Lucian shouting, Feyre, please. I shook so badly I could scarcely stand. The heat is there. And she pulls it. And she wins. She beats the task, technically.
But boy, is she ever taken down by how close she came.
She really is. And she falls to her knees. And this idea of, like, I couldn't read it and it had almost killed me. I hadn't even won properly.
Yeah. So she sinks to her knees, covers her face in her hands. I'll never beat the third test. I'll never free Tamlin or his people.
Yep.
But then the pain shoots through her bones again.
Yep. And so she just had this moment of, she's like, if I couldn't make it through task 2, like, I'm never going to make it through task 3. She comes so close to death here, and she is not handling it well.
She at this point, she just wants to curl up in a ball and die.
Yep.
But through her tattooed hand and the bond there, now Rhysand starts coaching her through how to handle this moment.
Yep. In her head.
Okay. This moment.
Yep. Don't let her see you cry. And he walks her through it. Put your hands at your side. Stand up. Stand. Don't give her the satisfaction of seeing your break. And he really walks her all the way through it. Stare her down.
Yeah.
Okay.
All this.
Count to 10. Don't look at Tamlin. Just stare at her. Okay.
Don't give her the satisfaction.
Don't do it. Yep. No. Walk away. Turn on your heel. Okay. Good. Walk towards the door. And he has to walk her through every single part of this. And that's what he's like, you can break down as soon as you get to your cell. Just don't do it here. Yeah. And she gets there, and she definitely does. I have there were so many interesting moments in here where one thing this reminded me of was, anyway, I love me some Brene Brown. I don't know who doesn't love some Brene Brown, and like the power of vulnerability and all of those things. But okay, so right now she's not okay, and we're like, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to cry. Crying's actually, by the way, like I made a post one time that said, crying cheaper than a juice fast, because there's actually like certain whenever you cry, when they test the tears, there are like stress hormones in there.
Oh.
There is actually research that there's a certain level of detox that happens when you cry, like on like a biological level, but also it helps reset the brain. Like if you're having like a really stressful or like fight or flight kind of moment, if you cry, and the research shows it has to be 2 emotional tears from each tear duct. That's the minimum baseline.
2
tears
from each. So 4 tears total.
Mm-hmm. And they have to be emotional tears. You can't just like smell an onion, like real tears. will reset the amygdala and get you back into rest and digest much quicker, where normally it would be a minimum 20 minutes. Like you can do that in like less than 5 if you're willing to let yourself cry.
Yeah.
So crying is really, really beneficial. And it's really helpful. And vulnerability is really helpful. But it's not safe to do in every situation.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter that those two things are good. Like, there are genuinely people who are safe and there are people who are not safe. And I think that's good because, like, the idea of, like, vulnerability is good. It's like, okay, you can't do that across the board. Like, nothing is that black or white. Just like when the idea of, like, is an apple healthy? I'm like, that's too vague. Like, how many apples? In what form? Are they organic? Is it juiced? Are there 8 of them? Is it a half of one that's whole? And, you know, does the person have epilepsy that they're managing with a keto diet? Like, you can't just say like eating apples are good or eating apples are bad, because there's context. Like, crying and vulnerability, yeah, great things, but not everyone's a safe person to do that around. Not every person is safe for us to be vulnerable around, and that's wisdom to know which is which.
Yeah. And not that we always have control in a moment like this.
Right. Sometimes you just can't.
If she hadn't had that voice there walking her through that whole thing, she would never have gone through that situation.
Thank goodness he did. But by the way, on the crying note, do you like, are you a crier? Like, do you feel like you cry?
I love it. I go through seasons when I cry, and I love it when I'm in my crying season. I'm not in one right now. I haven't cried in a couple weeks at least.
My neurofeedback therapist like gave me the assignment of like, I'm supposed to cry once a week. I just can't. Like, I really struggle.
If anybody has any good movie recs,
and that's usually what I have to do is like a movie or music. But this was one of those things. This was sort of a, you know, a weird like catch-22 where as a kid, if I cried, I got in trouble. And I've already told you, like, I have a fear around getting in trouble.
Yeah.
So when my body starts to cry, my nervous system is triggered that it's unsafe, and then I automatically shut it down.
Oh, shit.
Right?
This is such a problem.
Is this such a problem?
That's so tricky.
And sometimes I can be with people that I can be talking and I can feel safe enough, but I really do have to walk myself through it, because I get to that place and I feel my brain go, don't do that, that is really, no. Like, that's really safe. I'm like, no, it's fine. It's fine. And I've had moments where I do, but I know how helpful crying is, and yet I really struggle to do it. I really, really struggle. Sometimes years at a time without crying. Years at a time.
It's so hard.
Yeah. And then I see people, and I know people who they can just like going through their day, just like drop of a hat, like cry for 2 minutes and then just go on. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing ever. And I'm like, that's so good for your amygdala. Like that's gonna help reset things so fast. I'm like, I wish I could do that.
Yeah, I'm so grateful when I can. I'm always like, oh, that felt good. Okay, thanks, guys. I'm good. I have to always reassure my kids, because kids seeing their mom cry, it's always stressful for them. They're like, Mom, what's the matter? And sometimes it's like, no, these are good. These are good. These are 100% good.
Yeah.
100%. I'm happy. I'm so grateful I'm crying right now.
Yeah. And I've had some seasons like that too, where I've been able to like cry more. And I will tear up at almost nothing in movies. And they're like, really? You're crying at that? I'm like, guys, no. Like, I'm trying to. Like, if I'm watching a movie and there's a thing where I'm like, oh, that's remotely sad. Remotely sad. Go for it. Just squeeze it down. I gotta get 2 out. This is my homework. You know?
Super high.
Of course, I would find a way to make crying part of my to-do list. Let's just take a moment to recognize the truth in that. But gosh, it feels so good. Yeah, I had a moment one time where like it started to come, and it was kind of like an awkward moment, but I was like, everybody I just gotta go with it. We're good. Everything's good. But like, I think I could just like have like a solid ball it out moment. I'm just gonna go do that right now. And just, you know, it's super helpful. Yeah, but for this one, so yeah, I'm like, it's good, but recognizing that not everyone is a safe person for us to be vulnerable around. And I think the hard thing with that is knowing like, when is the person actually unsafe, and when is that more about us not feeling safe with anyone? And it's a hard one to navigate, and I don't think we have to do it perfectly. Yeah, but it's a good reminder. Oh, but I love this that he talks her through it. I deal with myself this way too, by the way. Like, sometimes I feel like we just have to walk yourself through stuff.
Be your own voice in your head going, stand up. Now count to 10. look her in the eyes.
Yeah.
I love this.
I thought this is
I'm going to become this for myself after this scene.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can do that.
I do this most often when people talk about like being mindful or present. Because I'm like, how do you do that? Because like my mind just wanders all over the place. And I realize that in order for me to be really present with a task, I just have to narrate it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, I want to be really present washing my hands. It's like, okay, I'm reaching for the faucet. I'm turning the knob. I'm putting my hands under the water. I'm feeling the water. I'm moving my hands against themselves. And the only way I can really keep my mind totally focused on a task is if I keep up a steady stream of intentional dialogue that doesn't leave room for my brain to go talk about think about something random.
Because you're using that left side of your brain that
Yeah.
like needs language.
Yeah.
You're just assigning it a language task that
Yeah.
helps you be mindful and present. I like that.
Yeah. So I had a friend who she talked about like breaking down, in her mind, it was like break down the task into, 50 steps. I was like, okay, that's what I call like narrating, but it's the same thing. It's like you're making a pot of tea. It's like, okay, I'm opening open cabinet, grab cup, do this thing, and like thinking about it in steps either way. But I realized like that vagueness of like just be present. I think that so many of us, we hear things like that. We're like, what does that mean? Or how? And for people who are really good at being present, like they would never think about explaining it to somebody, the actual mechanics of the how to, because it comes so naturally. But as a person who is the opposite of ever being present, I'm like, okay, what does that actually look like? And understanding that a lot of it was me just like needing to narrate and talk myself through exactly what's happening. At least during like the training phase for it.
Yeah, it's another good trick.
Yeah.
I like it.
Okay.
Good mind tricks. And then she wept for hours.
Oh.
Wept for hours. That's been a while since I've wept for hours. But
right. Oh, and this shortcomings word. Did you put a flag there?
Yeah.
My shortcomings has caught up with me.
And I like that now, of course, and this is what happens sometimes, is that she's crying for hours, and she's not just crying about this. She's crying for everything she'd lost, every injury she'd ever received, every wound, physical or otherwise. The part of her that's the artist part of her that's now hollow and dark and empty and useless again.
And she said, I would never paint again. I would never see the sun again. Oh my gosh. So she's okay, and so then we've got this. The walls are closing in. The ceiling drops. So she's back in her second trial, but this time she's like, I wanted to be crushed. Like I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't keep myself in my body. The walls were forcing me out of it.
And now she doesn't have Lucian there yelling, "Just make a choice," which would at least snap her out of her downward spiral.
Gosh, there's so much in this. Now, this idea, I was grasping for my body, but it hurt too much each time I tried to maintain the connection, which we had talked about. Was that the last one where we talked about, sometime in the last couple episodes, the idea of it sometimes being in your body isn't like a safe space. By the way, totally random. Have you ever experienced, or like, what are your thoughts on things like astral projection? That's a really random topic. Have you ever experienced that? Like being out of your body?
I don't think I have experience. I've read a lot. I've tried. I've read a lot of those things that like gives you like the how-to of lucid dreaming, the how-to of astral projection. I've not been successful yet.
Not been successful.
I like the idea a lot.
It's not a thing that I've ever experienced either. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, but I know a lot of people who have, and it's really fascinating. I know a lot of the narcolepsy community deals with astral projection. I've loved having some like really deep conversations about all of that. But I used to experience sleep paralysis, which usually people who have
that's
one.
Terrifying.
Usually people have one who have others.
You talk about this with our other friend who has the same thing, and that's straight out. That is straight out of these books. No wonder you're drawn to this. I
feel like
a normal day for me.
I feel like the longer this podcast goes on, the more moments where you're like, I didn't realize how dark your stuff was. I'm like, welcome to the recesses of my mind.
I do remember you guys talking about this horrible sleep paralysis. If you haven't heard about it, it's
really
terrifying.
rough. I don't experience it very much. And it's funny, I went a lot of years without having it, but then, gosh, when was it? it was maybe a year ago. I had one instance of it. Like I hadn't had it for years. I had it daily for a really, really long time. Speaking of other things, I'd mentioned I've got like issues with crying. I also have issues with napping because it didn't happen when I was sleeping. It happened when I was napping. So the same thing, like,
Yeah.
I am still working through my trauma around taking naps because my brain associates napping with sleep paralysis. So I really struggle to do that. As soon as I think,
Sleep, you're going to tell people sleep paralysis involves the creepy vision and everything, right? So they know. Because sleep paralysis just sounds like I'm so tired that I can't even move, which I've had that, where you're like
yeah,
awake and you can't, especially if I'm on medication or something after I had my wisdom teeth. I remember like I was sleeping, but I knew I was sleeping. I could feel the bed under me. I was awake. That's what sleep paralysis sounds like to me. But you and our other friend both had other experiences that went with it.
yeah,
It wasn't just not being able to move.
yeah, it's very dark, and everybody's is a little bit different. And I feel like what I experienced was actually pretty mild compared to what other people experience. So I'm like, I feel like I've experienced just enough to be able to relate, but not enough to be able to speak to it deeply for what other people do. But yeah, so it's one of those places where, yeah, it's like your eyes are open and it's like you're awake, but your body's paralyzed and you can't move. And then yeah, it's usually very dark stuff. So for me, what happened was like the things that I could physically see in my room would transform into creatures that were trying to get me, you know? And it is
The
usually
naga, the bogey,
oh my
the
gosh.
adder, they're
If,
all just
if
crawling
I
off the walls to get you.
if I'd had these books, then it probably would have transformed into something like this. But it's usually dark. There's a lot of interesting things where like if you watch people draw like the monsters that they see, like everybody draws the same monsters. There's a lot of theories.
That's where it gets
It gets really
really especially terrifying.
it
Why are they
gets
all the same?
it gets really scary. But I never but this idea of like people who have experienced like being out of their body, I like I said I haven't experienced it, and I will say I think the first time that I heard somebody say that it sounded so off. But I mean, stories from people who are like I really trust, like really grounded, solid people, who've experienced this sort of thing. And I think at the end of the day, it just reminds me that there's so much out there that I don't know. And while I used to be a person, you know, being raised in this like conservative Christian, like Midwest home, like if you'd never heard of it and you'd never experienced it, then they're obviously lying or weird. Again, I'm like, okay. I'm just like, there's just so much out there that we don't know or understand. And I think when I think about like friendships and people who I enjoy being around, like I enjoy being around people who are open, like, and like I'm open, and I will still have the reaction where somebody will say something, and I recognize my first reaction is, I don't know, like I don't know about that, but tell me more, like right, but like tell me more, like I want to hear and I want to understand, and there are things that, you know, 5 years ago I would have thought sounded absolutely out in left field that now I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds pretty,
It's probably true.
it's pretty normal. There's so much out there. Okay, that was a really random tangent, but so she wasn't necessarily saying that that's what happened. It just made me think of this. But so she's in full on panic, and it's very much related to what she just experienced, which this is very much how trauma works. We go through something really traumatic, and then we have these flashback moments where we feel like we're back in that same space. So I feel like this is like a combination of both. And then who shows up?
The ripple in the darkness.
Rhysand.
And I just absolutely love his take on the situation. Here she is, absolutely rock bottom to rock bottom to rock. She couldn't get any lower, and he just comes in all casual. You've just beaten her second task. Tears are unnecessary.
Okay.
So good.
Super helpful.
So
Thank you for
casual.
that.
Thank you, Reason.
But also I think that there's an interesting thing where, you know, she's covering up her face, so all she's seeing is what's in her head, and then he pulls her hands from her face, and as soon as he does that, she's like, oh, the walls weren't actually moving, the room was open. Oh, right. This is what's here, and he's in front of me. Which again, little like random tips, like this is, I love how just random these podcasts are. Like it's one of those things where I'm like, gosh, you just end up collecting so much information. Like I'm just so loving having a random place to say it all. And we're like not even scratching the surface. I'm like, there's just so much stuff there. But when you're dealing with this, like when you're dealing with one of those things where like you're not in the present moment, like one of the most helpful things that you can do if you're dealing with flashbacks or extreme emotion is to stop and ground yourself in the room that you're in. And it like that is literally as simple as like naming an object, right? It's like, this is a cup, this is an ink pen, this is a table, this is a chair. And again, it's that connectivity where you're having to access language centers. You're getting this other part of your brain online. You're reminding yourself like that you're here, you're not there. Yeah. Right. And sometimes I tell myself where I am. It's like, okay, I'm in California, which reminds me I'm not in Illinois where that thing happened. I'm not in the state where that person is. Like, I'm here. And sometimes people will say that they're even to the place where they can't access language, or they can't access like the names for things. And so they can do colors though. Right. So, okay, this is black, this is blue, right? This is white. And sometimes if they can't find the name for the object, you can do a color. But even if I'm like, yeah, I don't know if that was a trauma trigger, I just feel like I'm all over the place, like stopping to come back to the room and just reminding myself where I actually am in space and time is so helpful for pulling us out of whatever sort of spiral we're in. And it's really simple too. It's one of those things where like, that's not complicated. It's like name objects in the room.
It's very simple. But
the science of what actually happens in our brain and in our body and how it stops that spiral is really important. So I love that she did this here. She's like, oh, right, here I am in my cell.
Here I
like,
am.
This is, oh, right, this is where I am. I'm not.
Isn't lowering.
I'm not there. Okay, and then this moment. Where are we at? So I'm on 368. So she tried to pull away, but she couldn't. And he licks her face.
Okay. So good. But he knew we see when we get through it, and she realizes that like he had to do something to snap her out of where she was. Like,
yeah, and at first
gently wiping them away just wouldn't have done it. He knew it would take licking her freaking face.
And she was like, she was so shocked. Okay, I do love too that she had this very weird like sort of sexual response.
My body went taut and loose all at once, and I burned, even as chills shuddered along my limbs.
She's like, and he kind of like kept going. She's like, and only when his tongue danced along the damp edges of my lashes that I jerked back. And she's wiping her face, she's glaring at him. But he's like, yeah, I figured that would get you to stop crying. She's like, it was disgusting. And he's like, was it?
Like, beneath all your pride and stubbornness, I could have sworn I detected something that felt differently. Interesting.
Get out. As usual, your gratitude is overwhelming. I love that. So I love that they have this this banter. Yeah, but also again, she's faced with like him now knowing that she can't read, and her being really, really frustrated by that.
And then he, of all people, like it's bad enough that her life is forfeited to him, but to know that they have this bond where he can now freely read her thoughts and feelings and communicate to her, that's just a whole nother level.
Yeah. This was another interesting moment. So this idea of, all the way back to our first mention of the spring court, whenever Tamlin and Lucian are talking about the night court and how awful and horrific and terrible they are. And now she's going to spend a week there, every month of her life. And this is his first reference to what that might actually look like. And he's like, well, assigning you to learn to read.
Yeah, I know. It's like your torture.
I've been thinking of ways to torment you when you come to my court. And then he brings up, teaching her to read. And I think that's the first, like, that's a different look than I'm guessing what.
Slightly more civilized than the roasting over a spit.
A spit, right?
That you're assuming would be happening with the torment.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, I think that makes us kind of curious for the future.
Torment.
Very different. But okay, so she's mad at him, and she's every curse she could at her hand, but then, okay, this final sentence. It took me a long while to realize that Rhysand, whether he knew it or not, had effectively kept me from shattering completely.
Yep.
He didn't do it in the nicest way. It was all a little bit weird. But she was really, really struggling. Okay, which leads us right into...
She's not out of her depression now. She still goes into just a horrible permanent darkness settling over her. But
Yeah, so what followed?
At least she survived enough to be depressed.
Right,
Because
right.
depressed is definitely, even though depressed I think is like as low as, almost as low as it goes on the spectrum. Shattering completely would be
There is a step below
in
that.
the negative.
There is a step below that where it's like, you know, where you genuinely have you can genuinely have a mental break.
Yeah.
A mental break is different than depression. And she was on the verge of of a mental break and wanting it to end. Yeah. But yeah, so we didn't go there. But she does say that, you know, what followed the second trial was a series of days that I don't care to recall. And those of you following, we're now in chapter 41.
Chapter 41, yeah. Now she's looking forward to this goblet of fairy wine every night.
Yeah, she's like, and she's realizing, she's like, I was fighting for decades. Like, it's a flash in a lifetime. Like,
Yeah.
and
like at best, even if I win, I'm fighting for decades, which in the life of an immortal, that's like, I don't know, couple months, couple years at most, it would feel like.
Gosh, her thinking here. And, you know, so now we're greedily drinking the wine because she's like, I wasn't going to leave this mountain alive.
Stop thinking about color, stop caring about who she was and what mattered to her.
For anybody, and like for anybody who's dealt with depression in those low times, I'm like, yeah, it just feels utterly hopeless.
Yeah.
I mean, again, different context, but I think just the tenor of the thoughts, even if a person's thoughts sound different, I'm like, that idea of like it's never going to get better.
Yeah.
And it would be better if it was over. Like, oh, girl. It's just super rough. Okay, so where are we at right here? So she's... Oh, right. So then we have this scene in the hallway where she's going to go get dressed for the night, and we overhear this conversation. So again, we're still getting those bits of information that we don't necessarily understand, but we understand that there is more stuff going on here, and this is the Adder and one of Hybern's minions having a conversation. Just kind of tucked in the middle of her depression. Again, a reminder. I think the, you know, my metaphorical reminder there is there's always more going on. Like, it can feel like our world and our emotional state is the only thing happening. But it's like, right, there's this whole world out there with things that are happening outside of the depression she's experiencing in her cell, and that's happening outside of her world and what's happening for her. And I think it is helpful to remember that, like, in the midst of when our lives are really difficult, sometimes it does take moving to a more global perspective, or just any perspective can be helpful. But one thing I will say with that, there is a huge difference between us giving ourselves a dose of perspective and somebody else trying to give it to us.
Do you have an example to go with that, Lorrie?
I have a book of examples to go with that. I have so many. You know, and it definitely is one of those things where there are times whenever I've been going through something really difficult, or you know, with chronic illness, to stop and look at my like chronic illness and say, where's the lesson here? What is the thing I can learn? Like, what is my body trying to tell me? There are questions like that, or the question of, how could this be happening for me? Is a really powerful question when you're asking it of yourself from like love and curiosity. It's a lot different than somebody like you telling me like you're really struggling, and I'm like, well, what's it trying to teach you? What are you learning from this? And it's like, it comes across so invalidating. You're like, hey, I am just like struggling at the depths of depression. I'm like, well, it's probably for you, right? That's definitely happening for you. Are you tuning into how it's happening for you? Like, bleh. Like, there are things that we can say to ourselves, and there are things that even in like a really, really trusted relationship that can be asked of us. And that is so different than trying to force perspective on another person out of judgment.
Unsolicited growth opportunities.
Unsolicited growth opportunities.
That's one of my new vocabulary terms, thanks to Lorrie. Thanks to, where'd you get that from?
Simone Soul.
So good. Unsolicited growth opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, no, thank you. Like when somebody, and I tell you what, I have had that a number of times whenever somebody asks how I'm doing, like whenever they would ask how I was doing and I would tell them the truth. And then I get like well, you should be more grateful. Well, well, at least it's not this. Where it's like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, did you want me to lie? Got friend. Okay. In the same week, someone came in and they're like, how are you? And this was when things were terrible. Every time I went to the doctor, they're like, okay, you can't do this anymore. You can't do this anymore. And it was like, you can't push yourself in your wheelchair anymore because you're dislocating too many ribs and shoulders. You can't wear shirts that have to go on over your head anymore because that doesn't work. You can't carry a purse. You can't do this. And every week it was, you can't do this anymore because your body can't handle it. And each thing that they said I couldn't do was basically like, because my condition was believed to be permanent and degenerative, they're like, it's gone forever. So I feel like every 3 days I was having to grieve a part of my life. And in the same week, somebody came over and they're like, how are you doing? And I told them the truth, which was some version of like really bad, like really bad. And I got this speech about how I needed to be more grateful. Okay. And again, this is me like wanting to do it right. And so I think 2 days later, somebody else came over. How are you doing? And so I'm like, okay, well, this is going on, but then here's all the things that I'm grateful for. And they gave me a speech about how I needed to be more real.
So good.
Is it? I mean, it makes a good story now.
Fertilizer good.
And then I'm like, and at the time I just totally had, exactly, I had a tantrum. I'm like, I can't do this right. Be more honest, be more real. But the idea that everybody had an opinion about how I should be handling my life falling apart, I definitely did. It did help me get to a place at one point where I'm like, yeah, like unsolicited growth opportunities. Like, what if you kept your opinions to yourself until you walk a day in my shoes? And I think for a lot of people, I got to the place of, I'm like, I don't want your advice. Like, or how about this? I will consider listening to your advice if you come over and clean my toilets.
Ooh.
Because that's what I could actually use.
Bet you got a lot less advice after that.
I'm like, why don't you come over and actually do something that's helpful? Like like I'm telling you my life is falling apart and you're telling me you were grateful. Like, what about like your life is falling apart? How can I help?
Yeah.
It's like I've got a newborn and a toddler and 3 appointments a week. Why don't you come drive me to one? Why don't you go pick us up some groceries? Why don't you do something other than come over here and tell me how I ought to be feeling different about this condition? And then maybe I'll listen to whatever it is you have to say. But until then, you can just keep that to yourself. For sure. I went through an angry phase.
I think that was a very justified angry face. Jeez.
Oh, but all that to say, she gets this moment here of understanding, like, right, there is a world outside of her. And when I can do that for myself in a shame-free way, oh my gosh, I hate that though. When people realize it's like that they haven't been grateful for their health or something for a while, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm doing something wrong because I wasn't grateful. It's like, okay, no. Don't do like the thing where you make yourself ashamed because you weren't doing it. Like, but this is a thing that can be helpful if we move into it. But perspective outside of our situation, I think, is really helpful when we can do it from love and care. So she gets this moment in the midst of her depression. And then I love that, like, right after that, I sink so far into myself that it took something extraordinary to pull me out again. Okay, but then I love this scene.
Yes.
Were there passages that stood out to you in this one? There's so many good ones. I feel like we could just read this whole like 2 pages. But those of you following along, so this is the scene where she's in her cell and then suddenly she starts hearing music.
Yeah, she thinks she's hallucinating.
She thinks she is.
Yeah, but I love this. This wasn't music to dance to. It was music to worship, music to fill in the gaps of my soul, to bring me to a place where there was no pain. And she clung to the music, gripping it like a ledge that kept her from falling.
Oh, she did. And I love this. It was either a sunset or a sunrise. This is just such a beautiful passage to read. And I love that it concludes with, I hadn't realized how badly I didn't want to tumble into that deep dark, how much I wanted to stay here among the clouds and color and light. Now, I think a lot of people who go through, again, this is one of those things where when you read a book, it happens a lot quicker. But that moment when you realize, like, among depressive thoughts and among those thoughts of like, maybe it would be easier or better if it was over. Like that thing that reminds you that you want to live. I love that she had this moment. It's like, right. But it's like she almost had to like taste a little bit of goodness to realize that she really wanted it.
Yeah.
So this was a fantastic moment for her, and in the midst of such a justifiably deep, dark space, thank God she comes out of this like really deciding that she wants to live. And she weeps again, like she's crying, but this is different than the
this is that good cry.
This is that good
amazing
cry.
After it's the tears gradually cool. You know that when you have the hot tears and they're just hot, and then you have these where like at the end of it your face feels all cooled off and you're like,
yeah. This was more of a cleansing was.
Trembling and weeping, too raw and exposed, left naked by the music and the color in her mind. But when the tears had stopped and the music still echoed in her every breath, she lay on her pallet of hay listening to her breathing.
Yep. And she remembers, she's like, it was this I was fighting for, this I had sworn to save. And she comes out of this dark time remembering what she's doing, why she's here, what's happening for her, what the point is of living. And just in time, because there's only 2 more days before her final trial. And again, it's mixed feelings that we have Rhysand to thank for part of this, because we've got mixed feelings about him. But this reminds me a little bit of some of the stuff that we've talked about too with, your Bliss detective stuff that we talked about really early on. I was just talking to somebody recently, and like when they talked about their life, like there was just no, when they talked about the future, there was just no passion. And whenever I was asking kind of like what they saw, like all the options they had laid out, like just none of them were very exciting. Even they're like, it's like, well, it could go this way, that'd be really bad, or it could go this way, that was really good. But even their like good version, like they talked about it with like, there was no excitement. There just wasn't, but just reminding me like how important it is to have something that we are passionate about, something we are fighting for, something that we are moving towards. Because as we talked about from the very beginning of this book, like life is sometimes hard, and like real hard stuff. And like if we don't have that thing, if we don't have some vision of what we're going towards, even if it's vague, it's so easy to get swallowed in the hard that is right here and now. But the idea of like dreaming, I think that it's one of those things that a lot of people think are, again, back to our favorite moment, like that it's more serious or respectable to be just like honest about how hard stuff is. It's like, okay, yes, we need to be honest about how hard stuff is and hope for the future, because otherwise things just get dark and stay dark.
Yeah.
So friends, it's worth it, like taking time to dream, taking time to vision. It's not a useless task in the midst of your to-do list. I think it's one of those things where most people would be really served by carving out time, even if it's only once a month, to dream and vision and like think bigger, because it is that pulls us through the times when it's like, okay, right now, today, it's too much and it's overwhelming, and today feels like all there is. But that reminder, like that there's a future that we're going towards, there's more outside of us, and to have something that we feel passionate enough to get out of bed at. And that's one of the questions that I ask when people present a vision of like, here's this thing that I want to go towards. I'm like, is that going to be enough to like get you out of bed? And it's not. A lot of times it's kind of like Feyre's dream, where it's small and it's limited and it's better than where they're at, but it's not enough to pull them through the hard times that are going to happen on the way to there.
Yeah.
Okay, Feyre. In chapter 41, 2 days away from her final trial, and then I would learn what the eddies of the cauldron had planned for me.
She's believing in fate in the cauldron.
More and more.
There she goes.
I mean, like, she's having these moments where I'm like, how could she have ever predicted this? I mean, I think it would be hard in this moment to not start to just be like, good Lord, we'll see.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep, dark episode of the ACOTAR podcast. And we would love, if you have not already, for you to come over to our circle, our community on Circle, which is ACOTA, ACOTAA.circle.so, where we have these podcasts posted along with discussions and fan chats, and then you can get vulnerable with one of our deeper group journeys. We'd love to see you there.
Bye. Guys.